represent them. We love to have you out and encourage you to join. We get many benefits through programs like this today. Also, our historical review for Berks County. This is a quarterly journal. It's been published since 1935. Very proud of it. Four issues a year, as well as notification on programs such as this and our members update. So it really is a wonderful organization and a lot of benefits that go with it. Now, I'd like to tell you about some of the events that we have coming up. And I'd start by talking about on Saturday, the 10th of April at 10 a.m., we have Kids Interactive Theater. Kids Interactive Theater this year is in keeping with our last full measure exhibit on the Civil War. And it is an interactive, it's a children's program. They say suitable for children 3 to 17, but I can assure you, it's all ages. Every time Kitty Jones is here doing this program, it's wonderful. The parents enjoy it as much as the kids. So this year, kids will be here. That's Charlotte Beauregard, who will tell us about the ordeals and the hardships she and her fellow Southerners endured during the Civil War. Then, at 10 a.m. on Saturday, the 12th, is Knights of the Golden Circle, from Southern Secession to Berks County. And our speaker is going to be David Keene. If you're not familiar, Knights of the Golden Circle are Southern sympathizers all around the country. There were many strongholds of the Knights of the Golden Circle here in Berks County. So that's going to be a very interesting, and I would call it a provocative program. So I encourage you to come for that. Then on May 10th at 10 a.m., we have the American flag, past, present, and future. Michael Axelrod, Executive Vice President of the Philadelphia Flag Day Association, is going to be talking about some of the myths and misconceptions that surround the U.S. flag, such as, Betsy Ross really stitched that first flag? Come and find out. Then on Sunday, May 18th at 2 p.m., we're going to have 1960s Music Trivia Day. Name that too. That's in keeping with our current programming schedule of the baby boomers generation's 50th anniversary. So, with all that said, we are very fortunate to have here today the Confederation of Union Generals. Before we introduce them, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mary Walker. Dr. Walker.
Thank you. I think I can hear me.
Okay.
Tell me if you can't hear me. My name is Dr. Mary Walker, and I'm here to lead a discussion from the women of Coup. You have to bear with us. This is the first time our group has done it, and in some ways this really mimics what happened during the Civil War in the role of women. Certainly before the Civil War, women were not considered equal to men. The role primarily was to take care of the family. The role was to be supportive of their husbands. Women in general were there to look beautiful and pay attention to the dress. But a lot of things had to change for women during the Civil War. And they took on many different roles during that time. Women now without husbands had to take care of the family, had to take care of the house, had to take care of the business, had to take care of the farm and do all the farming. Women took on other roles as well. They became nurses, they became doctors, like myself. They became spies during the Civil War. Women dressed as soldiers and worked in disguise where even men on the battlefield. There were women who also followed the troops and were of help to the men on the battlefield as well. What I'd like to do is I'd like to have each one of the women who are here to introduce themselves and say a little bit about what the role was in the Civil War. And then what I would like to do is just open this up for questions, and we will be prepared to answer whatever you'd like to ask us.
Hello, I'm Mary Walker. Excuse me. See, I'm nervous too. I'm Mary Letterman. I'm married to Dr. Letterman, who is the Chief Medical Officer of the Army of the Potomac. I spent most of the war either with my family on our farm in Maryland, and then after I got married, I moved to Philadelphia to be nearer to my husband. In Philadelphia, I became active with the, I'm sorry, I've lost the word. The Sanitation Commission. Please, I'm more nervous than okay. Sorry, I guess I did with this. I became active with the Sanitary Commission and helped provide things for our soldiers that I don't know why, but the Army itself could not provide proper nutrition for especially the wounded. And so we raised money and we purchased things. We held a tremendous fair in Philadelphia near my home in Logan Square and raised a great amount of money for the care of the wounded soldiers. My mother also came to live near me in Logan Square because she could not keep the farm going in Maryland. We are a very good, strong Union family. In fact, I met my husband through General McClellan. He introduced us, I have to admit. But they could not keep the farm going because the servants would no longer work. With all the talk of emancipation in the air, we could not get the servants to work. And the white farm labor that we could hire, they had all gone off to fight. So my mother came to join me in Logan Square. Thank you.
Hello, I am Marie Tepe. I'm a Boulandier. I joined the Collis Zouaves in mid-August of 1861 as a Boulandier. He wanted his regiment to be as authentic as possible. I participated in 13 battles. I was wounded in Fredericksburg, and I received the Kearney Cross of Valor.
My name is Lily Devereaux Blake, and I was a writer during the Civil War in Washington as a correspondent. Later, I became a women's activist, actively involved with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Although I was born in the South, I've spent primarily most of my time in New Haven, Connecticut, and surrounded by abolitionists, so I was very fond of the cause.
My name is Mrs. Joan Hardraft. I did not have as exciting a life as these ladies. I basically stayed in Norristown while my husband was off fighting the war, raising our 6 children.
My name is Elizabeth Van Loo. I am a Southern Belle, born and raised in Richmond, Virginia. I'm from an affluent family. I was raised in the Churchill section of Richmond, Virginia. My father was a very successful entrepreneur who ran a hardware store. Throughout my entire life, I've had, throughout my youth, I really had a abolitionist sentiment within me. My parents sent me for an education here in Philadelphia through a Quaker school, and that really fostered a very strong, that took that sentiment I already had and grew it. So by the time I returned to Richmond, Virginia, it was very strong within me. So when the war started, that became forward for me, and I immediately started engaging in efforts to promote the Union's success, on the down low, of course. And acknowledged as having established one of the largest espionage networks during the Civil War, and am acknowledged in the literature as being instrumental in the success of the Union.
Good morning. My name is Mary Craig Hunt. I'm the wife of Brigadier General Henry Jackson. He was the Chief of Artillery for the Army of the Potomac. I also have not had quite as an exciting life as some of these ladies. I was born in Washington City. I basically stayed my whole life there, spent the war there, also raising our 6 children.
And as I said,
Dr. Mary Walker. I was the only woman to get a contract to work as an assistant surgeon on the battlefield in multiple battles during the Civil War, and I'm the only woman who ever got the Congressional Medal of Honor. I'm also very honored that I'm going to be speaking with the men later, which you'll be able to ask questions. But I'd really like you to focus on the other women here. So we're open to any questions, anything you would like to ask about women's roles, if you would like to ask about their the difficulties they had in the Civil War, if you'd like to ask about their clothing and how they dressed, and we're open to anything. Yes?
What's the definition of vivandier?
Vivandier was a French word which meant canteen girl, and that had originated in France.
Any other questions? Yes?
How often did you have the opportunity to see your husbands or visit with your husbands while you were off at work?
Not a lot. And let me just tell you just how dedicated and devoted these men were. In March of 1862, 2 of our children had come down with scarlet fever. I wrote my husband several times to please come home. He could not. They both died, and my husband finally came home in April. So that just gives you an idea of the scarcity of time you had with your husband. Some women actually traveled and followed them. I was not able to do that.
Again, mostly he was away, but my husband did, whenever he could, hurry off to Philadelphia to see me.
Other questions? Yes?
I'm a little more interested in the spy over there.
Well, interestingly, I never married. Very independent woman, lived with my mother in our mansion, the family's mansion, until she passed, and then I resided in that home until I passed eventually. So kind of a little bit out of the ordinary for that time period for women.
You know how big your spy really was?
It was very large. It ultimately is unknown how large it is and who is really involved in my espionage network. And that's because we want to keep those people out of the public eye because they don't need to be discovered and suffer the consequences of that. So a lot of people were not known ever.
Where was the mansion? In Richmond?
Churchill section, yeah, in Richmond, Virginia.
Back to Richmond?
Yes. I was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, and lived my entire life there. And I am a Southern belle, and I'm really committed to my Southern upbringing. However, I did have that abolitionist sentiment within me. And then when my parents sent me to Philadelphia to have a Quaker education, that's where it really, throughout my Quaker education, they kind of fostered.
Your parents did not own slaves?
Yes, they did. We had about 8. And after my father passed, he passed 14 to 15 years before the war even started of health reasons. And after he passed, I freed all of our slaves. And I kept a lot of them as my staff. But again, my abolitionist sentiment was very strong. So I was for the freeing of the slaves and their freedom.
Were there ever danger of being found out?
Oh, yes, yes. And progressively so toward the last, certainly toward the last few years of the war especially, because ultimately I started out really small. As soon as the war started, that sentiment came forward, and so I started out just trying to do small things to help the Union. Really benign things, going to the prisons in Richmond. There were a couple of prisons located in the Richmond area, and I would go to the prisons where my brother would go, where I would take one of my staff with me. We would take food, home-cooked food. We would take books, writing utensils, paper. We'd just talk with them. The prison environments were very, very bad, very poor, and the military that were captured and held there were not well cared for, and so that's where I started. Working for those military personnel, and then from there, it progressively was never enough. I always wanted to do more and more, so very quickly and started to engage in activities to help generals and other soldiers escape. So I established numerous safe houses in the area to help them get across the lines to the other side. So it became very, very intricately involved, very, very complex network. Starting with the working in the prisons and then helping them escape, and then doing lots of communicating with the generals on the other side. Details they needed to know in order to be successful in the battles. So yes, toward the last few years of my life, or toward the last few years of the war, they were very suspicious of me and watching me very closely. And as the closer they watched me, the more secretive I became in my behaviors, but I never stopped. I was very, very wise woman and very cunning, I guess. Oh yes, oh yes. Absolutely, yes. I've been acknowledged numerous times in the literature. In fact, General Grant, I communicated with him a lot the last few years of the war, helping him immensely with details that I would provide, because I had people established in certain areas, and I used my family's. In fact, I spent my entire family's fortune establishing and maintaining this network. So the last years of my life, I lived out in poverty after having been so affluent. But that's what I wanted. So spent all of my money, my family's money, establishing my network, maintaining that. It costs a lot of money to maintain safe houses and to pay people off, bribe people in the prisons in order to help me get escapes happen successfully. I established a staff member in the White House of the Confederacy, where President Davis would always have all of his meetings with his generals in his home, and I had someone established in there that would then have to be privy to all of that information, and then they would relay that back to me, and I would relay that across the lines to General Grant and a couple of other generals, General Butler, and so, yes, lots of literature out there.
You have a question here in the back?
Two questions, please. Where was you when Richmond was overrun? And, that slips my mind. And how did the South discover you was doing what you was doing, please?
My activities were suspected from the very beginning in my community, because I was, as soon as I started to be sympathetic toward the prisoners and of the Union military, immediately my community started to reject me and suspect that my sentiment was not where it should be. So from the very beginning, it started, and it just grew from there. Rejection, social rejection, suspicion, that just grew. And so ultimately, even after the war and throughout the rest of my life, I was so connected to my upbringing and my southern upbringing in Richmond, Virginia, that I still resided there. I refused to leave. Lived out my whole life there, despite that I was socially rejected the rest of my life. And where was I when Richmond was overrun? I was in my home. It was very dramatic when Richmond was overrun, and I, as soon as we were overtaken, I got onto my rooftop and with the American flag and was waving the flag in the faces of everybody. In fact, some of the town members then approached my home ready to burn it down, and I was screaming, "Go ahead, burn it down, General Grant is coming, and I know where you live and you live. You're going to get yours too." So they got scared and ran away. And then General Grant knew that I would be unsafe. So he immediately had soldiers come and protect me. So.
Thank you.
Did you live a long life?
Tonight. Yeah. Yes.
Did your plantation suffer any damages?
Yeah, the whole town was really, there was just damage across Richmond. But my mansion was not that terribly damaged, no. Yes.
I think one of the nicknames I've heard for you was Crazy Fat Blue.
Why does everybody know that?
Was that part of the cover that you gave
Yes.
yourself against Confederate cameras?
Yes, toward the very end, they were really hot on my trail. And I was doing a lot of things that were very risky because I was wanting the union to be successful, so I was taking a lot of risks. And so, yes, I did, they were, outside my home watching me, and I never knew where they were watching. So my behaviors needed to be more secretive and intricate. And so, yeah, sometimes I did kind of act a little out of sorts to throw them off my trail. Yes. But I would, some of the, just a few examples of some of the ways that I communicated, particularly with the generals, is I would write to them in invisible ink, and then I would write over the invisible ink with regular ink, "Dear Uncle," and then a general, letter to my uncle. And then the general would get the letter, and of course he knows that the real message is in invisible ink, so then he would, spread the milk over the letter, put it over the heat, and then it would come forth, the real message would come forth, and they would get my messages that way. I would send messages across enemy lines in the produce carts. They would be taking over, and, with food on there, I would hollow out eggs. Dozens and dozens of eggs. They all look like eggs to us, so they go right across, but there are hollow eggs in that group, and I have my messages in there, in the soles of the shoes, of people moving those carts. So lots of different ways that I sent my messages and communicated with the generals.
Thank you.
I think you might be interested. I was captured as a spy when I was on the battlefield as a physician. I was at Gordon's Mill, which was in Georgia, northern Georgia. I was captured. I was put into Castle Thunder, which was one of the horrific prisons in Richmond at that time. I was there for 4 months before I was exchanged. It was unbelievable conditions when I was there. You were fed once a day. The food was not edible. Rats, we were surrounded by rats. Everything was infested with vermin. We were only infrequently allowed to ever leave a room and have any fresh air, having any kind of exercise. When I was finally exchanged as a prisoner, I weighed under 80 pounds, and I had lost over 40% of my vision as a result of an infection during that period of time. So the conditions were really horrible if you were captured. Now, are there any other questions? Yes?
I'd like to know where you acquired your medical skills. Did you go to a university MD school, proprietary, or?
Yes, I did. I graduated from Syracuse Medical College. I graduated in 1855. During that period of time, there were 2 different kinds of medical schools, one called allopathic, one was called eclectic. I graduated from an eclectic medical school, which really taught a whole variety of medical courses, but a lot of the emphasis on the total health, on hygiene, on general medical care. It emphasized a little less surgical skills in this kind of medical school. But at that period of time, there was very few schools that admitted women at all. Eclectic medical schools did not admit women. This one did allow me to matriculate.
Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell also went there.
She went to Geneseo, right, which was very close to, I grew up in Oswego. This was the one that was closest to my home, which is why I went to Syracuse. She graduated about 6 years before I did. Now, are there any other questions for these women? Yes?
This one's kind of open-ended to anybody who wants to tackle it. Could you or any of these other ladies up here elaborate on how women got into the Army by various means? We know there's documented cases where the ladies did in fact disguise themselves as men and get into the Army. Would you care to just elaborate on that a little bit? And the things of hardships and things that they had to go through?
this isn't the answer. I don't really know how they did it, but I do know that they certainly did. And my husband would tell me that, he said, it was so strange, we brought in, we thought it was a young boy, and when we undressed to do the amputation, we discovered that it was really a woman. And that was the only time that they knew that this woman had managed to completely disguise herself and sign up and join a regiment, and everyone thought that she was a boy, and just didn't.
Well, as a volunteer, I actually enlisted as a female soldier. I was recruited, and I received a soldier's pay up until I served about 2 years, and there was a friction with the paymaster's office because they did not think that women should be in the Army. So they stopped my pay, but yet I continued to serve. There were a lot of women. They guesstimate about 400 women who were serving in the Army in one capacity or another. A lot of women followed their husbands, which I did. I followed my husband into the 27th Pennsylvania Volunteer, and he wished me to stay home and take care of our tailor shop. However, I wished to follow him, and I did. And there were women who did that, and there were other women who disguised themselves as men, and other women who would just follow the camps and just to be with their husbands or their sweethearts, and they would do things around the camp like the laundry, the cooking, the mending. However, volunteers were unusual in the fact that they also participated in battle, and I was actually wounded in battle, and I participated in 13 separate occasions.
How I got into the Army was being persistent, being aggressive, and totally obnoxious. And that wasn't difficult for me at all. They absolutely didn't want me. They didn't feel that women were physicians. They felt that nurse was the best that they could be. I started out volunteering, and I aggressively worked to attempt to get a commission. I spoke to every congressman. I wrote letters consistently to the president, to President Lincoln. And I talked to the head of the War Department. I talked to the head of the Army. I at least eventually got a contract, but I was never given a commission. And that was purely because I was a woman. We have time for one more question. So. Yes?
I have one more for the French lady. Would you explain what your husband eventually did to you? And were you mortally wounded then?
No, my wound, I took a bullet to the ankle, and that actually followed me through the rest of my life with the pain and discomfort for the rest of my living life. But what happened to me originally, this lady's referring to, is when I joined up with my husband for the 27th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, I also, as you see, I carry a whiskey barrel. And one of the things I did was I sold contraband items such as whiskey, hams, tobacco, that sort of thing. And I made quite a bit of money that way. And so one night when I was out, a group of men broke into my tent and stole $1,600 from in my tent. Now, in those days, that's an awful lot of money, so I must have been selling an awful lot of whiskey. Well, the group of men who were apprehended, and one of them happened to be my dear husband. So it was at that moment that I quit that branch, and I left my husband, left the regiment, and later on down the line, I joined Collis as Zouaves with another group, the 114th Pennsylvania Zouaves, and I remained with them to the end of the war, which I mustered out in May of 1865.
Are books written about you also?
Oh yes, it's Marie Tepe, T-E-P-E. There's a lot of information about her.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. We really appreciate it, and I believe that the men from Coop are now going to be presented.
Okay, once again, I would like to welcome the Confederation of Union Generals here at the Berks History Center. This is an organization that is dedicated to the authentic portrayal of historical figures from the Civil War in order to educate the public. These interpreters have spent countless hours researching their subjects in order to present an authentic interpretation of their generals. Right now, I'd like all men to please rise. Ladies, remain seated.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my high honor and distinct privilege to introduce to you the Commanding General of the Armed Forces of the United States, Lieutenant General Winfield Scott.
Good afternoon to you all. Obviously, we are the Confederation of Union Generals, and as indicated, we are a living history organization focused, obviously, on the Union side of the Civil War. The way we do business here is that each of us will give a very brief synopsis of who we are and what we did during the war, and also including after the war, if we survived. And then it will be up to you to ask us questions about our lives before the war, during the war, or after the war. What makes this program move and continue is your questions. I mean, we can stop at any time, but obviously we have a great group of people here. We want you to ask us questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. I am Major General John Hartranft from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. I served as the commanding officer first of the 4th Pennsylvania Volunteers and then the 51st Pennsylvania Volunteers. I'm a Medal of Honor recipient for the First Battle of Bull Run. By the end of the war, I'm a brevet major general stationed at Petersburg, and I am the one who stopped General Lee's last major offensive at a place called Fort Stedman. I was then military governor of Petersburg for a short time, and then following the assassination of President Lincoln, I was put in charge of the old military prison, and I, in essence, was the jailer of all of the 8 Lincoln conspirators. And then on July 7th, it was my responsibility to ensure that they were properly hanged in accordance with the law. After the war, I became the 17th governor of Pennsylvania, and ultimately, from my last years, from 1879 to 1889, I was the first commanding general of the Pennsylvania National Guard.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brigadier General Henry Jackson Hunt. I was born on the 14th of September, 1819. I graduated West Point in the class of 1839. I'm a career artillery officer. Never served in any other arm of the service. I became Chief of Artillery for the Army of the Potomac several days prior to the Battle of Antietam in 1862 and held this position to the end of the war.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Major General Nathan P. Berks from Massachusetts, former Speaker of the House, former Governor of Massachusetts, and commissioned as a Major General from President Lincoln himself. My first charge was to be Commander of the Department of Maryland, to bring order to the port city of Baltimore. From there, I went to the Shenandoah Valley, and I had to follow Stonewall Jackson up and down that valley family, we finally bumped heads down in Culpeper County. Well, they said it was their victory, but I know it was ours. From there, I became the commander of the Department of the Gulf and the Red River campaign, and Texas. And from there, after the war, well, I just kind of slipped into obscurity. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler from Lowell, Massachusetts, a political adversary and a political friend of General Banks before and after the war. I was much to my mother's chagrin, she sent me to Colby College to become a minister. I chose the law. So I was a lawyer before the war and after the war. I have no formal military training other than participation in the militia, Massachusetts militia prior to the war. I was responsible initially for the capture of Baltimore and the subduing of Baltimore before General Banks took command. I served in other commands over the course of the war and commanded various armies. My final command in the Army was the Army of the James, 1864 and early 1865. After the war, I served 10 years in Congress, where I was the lead prosecutor in the Johnson impeachment. Much to my chagrin, he was not impeached. I also was elected a governor of Massachusetts and continued my law practice into the early 1890s.
Now you know who the politicians are. Major General George Henry Thomas. I am born in 1860 in Newsom Depot, Virginia, West Point class of 1840. In December of 1864, I will be promoted to Major General in the regular Army, junior of 5, authorized by Congress in that position. Subsequently, I was Department Commander in the Pacific, having passed there in 1870.
My name is Colonel George W. Cullen, West Point class, 1833.
Graduated West Point in 1833, graduated 3rd in my class. U.S. Engineer. I am responsible for the Cullen Register of officers and candidates, candidates at West Point. I was aide-de-camp to Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, Chief of Staff to Major General Henry Halleck, Chief of Engineers for the Department of Missouri and Mississippi. I am a career Army officer, having served 41 years in the Army. I was also married to Elizabeth Hamilton, who was the granddaughter of Alexander Hamilton.
You'll have to forgive me. I'm suffering from dropsy and a bit of the gout today. My name is Lieutenant General Winfield Scott. I received my commission directly from President Thomas Jefferson in 1809, went on to serve 14 United States presidents. Was the second 3-star general appointed after George Washington. I participated in most, if not all, of the major conflicts that the United States had, from the War of 1812 on up through the Civil War. My main action in the Civil War came in the opening months when I developed a plan later dubbed the Anaconda Plan by the press, unfortunately. President Lincoln listened to my plan, but on pressure of others decided not to accept it until after my retirement. I retired on November the 1st of 1861 and moved to the Cousins Hotel at West Point as my retirement home. I remained a lieutenant general as a special consultant to the president, and in June of '62 he traveled with General Pope up to West Point for a conference with me, and at that time decided that most of the elements of my plan would be enacted, and in the end it was that plan that brought about the end to the conflict. I went on to serve President Johnson and succumbed at West Point on the 26th of May, 1866.
Hi, I am Major Dr. Jonathan Letterman, Chief Medical Officer of the Army of the Potomac.
I graduated medical school at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, and shortly thereafter served as a military physician in the Indian Wars in the West and in Florida. I became Chief Medical Officer of the Army of the Potomac and immediately reorganized the medical system. It originally consisted of regimental surgeons with little experience or training, and no organized system for evacuation and management of wounded. In several battles, wounded soldiers were left unevacuated on the field, sometimes for days or even a week or more to die. I established a system of field dressing stations, triage, professional ambulance corps, field hospitals, and base hospitals with triage at every level. These reforms reduced battlefield deaths from injuries by 60%. I also established better diets, with fresh fruits and vegetables to replace desiccated vegetables, which almost eliminated scurvy in the military. I also established a system for evaluation of training and qualifications of physicians, the first time this was actually done on a large scale, to see that the military physicians were qualified. These reforms were eventually adopted by all Union armies and eventually by all the armies of the world, and which are still in place today. And I am today considered the father of military medicine. Letterman Hospital and the Letterman Medical Institute are named after me. After the war, I went to San Francisco, where I did some medical practice and also became governor of San Francisco. My wife died, Mary Letterman here, died in 1869. I became severely depressed and died 3 years later at age 45.
As you already know, I'm Dr. Mary Walker. I was born in Oswego, New York in 1832. After going to medical school, I always wanted to join the war, feeling very patriotic and wanting to relieve the suffering of soldiers. I was on the battlefield in multiple battles during the Civil War. After my capture and imprisonment, my vision was so impaired that I really was no longer able to practice medicine. I did get the Congressional Medal of Honor both because of my meritorious work on the battlefield and because of the spy work and being captured. After the war, I primarily spent my time supporting women's rights, women's equality, and making as much a nuisance as I could of myself in Washington.
Brigadier General Horace Porter was born in April 15th, 1837 in Huntington, Pennsylvania. Father David was governor of Pennsylvania from 1839 to 1845. I graduated third in my class from West Point in 1860. My specialty was ordnance. I stayed on for at least one class to teach, then was sent to the Watervliet Arsenal on the Hudson River outside of Albany, New York. When the war started, I was there shipping supplies out as quickly as we could. I eventually ended up down in Savannah, Georgia, where I took control of the artillery and brought about the surrender of Fort Pulaski. I served under several different generals in the autumn of 1863 while we were in Chickamauga. During the retreat there, I managed to hold open a road so a lot of our supplies, artillery and wounded could get out. And for that I was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1902. I was introduced to General Grant a month later, and he got me on his staff, and I stayed with him for the remainder of the war and after the war until he became president. I was his aide-de-camp during the war. Afterwards, as a general, when he became the president, I was his private secretary. At least for his first term, I got rather tired of the Washington politics. And Abe Lincoln's son, Robert, got me a job as vice president of Pullman Palace Car Company, and I stayed there for over 20 years. About 1897, I managed to help William McKinley get elected president. And in gratitude, he gave me the position of ambassador to France. After my wife died in 1903, I stayed on the position there in France only because I had started a project which I completed, which was to bring John Paul Jones home. I resigned my position in 1905 and stayed in private life, working for the veterans groups, and died in 1921.
My name is Major John Mendenhall. I served in the Civil War in the Western Theater. I was a career artilleryman. I served in a variety of assignments in the Army of the Ohio, which became the Army of the Cumberland, at battery command level, Corps Artillery command level, and then served on the staff of General Thomas through the remainder of the war, ending up as commander of artillery for the Army of the Tennessee. I was born in 1829 in Bray, Indiana, graduated from West Point in 1851, served nobly in the Army of the Ohio and Cumberland, was brevetted to major at the Battle of Shiloh, brevetted to lieutenant colonel at the Battle of Chickamauga, and had material effect on the outcome of the Battle of Stones River at Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I stayed in service as an artilleryman and died in 1892, 6 months short of my mandatory retirement as commander of 2nd U.S. Artillery at Fort Adams, Rhode Island.
Captain Emery Upton, West Point class of 1861, colonel for the 124th New York. I led the breakthrough at the Muleshoe salient and Spotsylvania Courthouse. After that, I became general, and I was the only general to beat Nathan Bedford Forrest in battle.
Good afternoon. I'm not a general, but I do serve the Commander-in-Chief. My name is John Nicolay. I am personal secretary to President Lincoln. I was born in Bavaria, immigrated to the United States when I was 6, and became a printer's devil at 14, working in a print shop, ultimately owning the newspaper, later clerked in Springfield, where I met the president, and worked on his campaign, then came to Washington, served him for his entire term. After the war, I did go and write a 10-volume biography of the president with the other secretary, John Hay.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now it is up to you to ask the questions. First question. Yes, sir.
This is for the major. You graduated from West Point in 51, is that what you said?
Yes, sir.
During the war, there were so many people that were getting promotions left and right, and you served under and in some distinguished areas. Why didn't you get a higher rank?
Sir, I've often wondered that myself. As I thought through it, I think I have several reasons I was never promoted like some of my contemporaries or even junior officers. First and foremost, I'm an artilleryman, very diligent and accomplished artilleryman. Back in the Civil War, artillerymen commanded artillery companies, or later called batteries. That's a 100-man, 100-horse unit that has up to 6 cannon in it. And these batteries are assigned to brigade commanders, commanders of brigades of infantry. And we belong to those brigade commanders, and when we want to forget that, they remind us quite quickly. If you're going to be a major, or a lieutenant colonel, or a general, as the thought goes, then you have to have larger and larger and larger artillery units for these people to command, and to have staff officers to help them command them. The chief of staff of the Army at that time, General Halleck, had a very deep bias that artillerymen command batteries. Batteries is the largest artillery unit there is. They belong to brigade commanders. What need have we to be having majors or lieutenant colonels command? As a matter of fact, this commission I hold right now is not a regular Army major commission. It's a United States Volunteers Commission for Staff Judge Advocate. They did a trip. They made me a lawyer to give me the rank, to recognize me. There was such a bias against it. Fortunately, General Hunt didn't suffer from that bias. He served General McClellan, who was quite effective at not only getting his officers recognized by rank, but actually forming artillery at a very high level in reserve and deploying it as a reserve as it should be deployed. When you don't deploy artillery like that, you run into the possibility of sticking a battery pointing at a tree line, helping no one, assisting no one. So that's the difference between West and East. But in addition to that, the way people who are artillerymen, General Thomas was actually an artilleryman early in his career, get to be generals is you take a volunteer commission in one of the state militias perhaps, and you should get rank that way. I'd never had that opportunity. I was very, very focused, I think, from a personnel standpoint on artillery. And in addition to that, I am not a very loud, boisterous, self-promoting person in general. So I think that's why.
Between you and me, those political generals don't deserve the rank that you should.
I'll let your comments stand on its own merits.
Would we like a response? General Banks, would you care to address that? Or General Butler, or even myself, I am not a West Point graduate. I am a lawyer. But at the beginning of the war, or before the war, I actually commanded a regiment of the state militia. So although I am not a West Point graduate, I do have a background before the war in commanding troops, which I think helped me be most effective during the war. But I will turn it over to General Butler because I see he's ready for a rebuttal.
Those of us that were lawyers always had this rub between us and the West Point types, including General Halleck in particular, who had it out for a number of us. I would say, sir, that my record in the war is as distinguished as any of the senior officers and the things that I accomplished. I was also recognized by General Grant in his memoirs as being one of his ablest department commanders. The political sense that I brought to the job and the command was essential in managing the population, the troops. When I had to manage the city of New Orleans during the war, my political skill was essential to managing that recalcitrant population down there of treasonous secessionists. I also was responsible initially for opening up the rail lines to Washington City as the war broke out. You'll recall at the outset of the war, the capital was isolated. And it was because of my decisions and my actions in Maryland and Annapolis in particular, taking the seals of the state of Maryland so the legislature could not meet to secede. We kept Maryland in the Union early in the war. Had Washington City been isolated, the capital would have had to have been abandoned. So there were some decisive actions that some of us in the political generals took early in the war to save the capital and to basically initiate the war. And I would also say that those of us that were political generals, in my case I was a Democrat, I was handed my commission personally from the Commander-in-Chief, President Lincoln. I was recruiting Democrats into the war effort for loyalty, so it was essential to the war effort to have both the Democrats and the Republicans in the tent, so to speak. General Banks, do you have anything?
I appreciate your concern, sir. However, after running as governor of the state of Massachusetts for 4 years, I think that gave me enough experience. That's all I have to say.
Next question. Yes, sir, in the back there with the hat.
The gentleman in charge of the batteries and the artillery, so I'd like to address this to you, sir, if I could. What kind of ordinances and how did they improve before, during, and after the war that you used in your cannons?
When we began the war, most of our weaponry were smoothbore cannon, firing, shot or canister or shell type munitions. The main improvement at the beginning of the war, and it was meant for accuracy and also for distance, was the rifling of the bore. And my particular batteries, when I was in the Army of Ohio, they were 3-inch ordnance rifles and also 10-pound Parrott rifles. They were rifle, allowing the ordnance to spin, therefore fly at a straighter trajectory and longer. There was a disadvantage, though, in one part of that rifling, is that when it came to shot, where you're doing about a cannonball and smooth bore, or just a pure bolt coming out of a rifle cannon, those are normally used against fortifications, walls, to try to knock them down. Not very often against personnel. When they were used against personnel, they were the smooth bore cannonballs were made to bounce along the ground and affect as many personnel as possible. For the rifled cannon, that bolt would go straight into the ground and harm no one. So when we went to rifle, there was actually still by mid-war there was still preference to use the Napoleon smooth bore cannon as the mainstay. That was the main. There were time fuses in terms of innovations, but they were very early and maybe not as reliable as you would like. General Hunt, do you have anything to add to that? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
If I may. The British had developed breech-loading guns, which a few were used at Gettysburg. The U.S. didn't have very many, but they did develop some later in the war. Were not used very often, but developed much later after the war. And so by the time the Spanish-American War came about, they were much better shape.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
You are probably aware as a contemporary person that there is a movement underway to recognize Alonzo Cushing for what happened in Gettysburg and his command as artillery unit. As a artillery person after the war, do you think that what he did was that exceptional and that it was really worthy of having a Congressional Medal of Honor awarded? Or was what he did pretty much what a lot of people did on the battlefield?
As I served in the West, I heard about Alonzo third hand. Could I refer this to General Hunt?
Did you even hear the story about it?
I did not, ma'am.
I had the opportunity to visit with Lieutenant Cushing shortly before he was killed. I was making an inspection of artillery positions. Lieutenant Cushing's battery was in a very exposed position. We had drawn fire before the Confederate cannonade began. We had to duck and cover ourselves, otherwise we would have been killed before the fight really started on July the 3rd. Lieutenant Cushing, from my understanding, I did not see him fall, but the way it was reported to me, he himself fired what I believe to be his last round of canister and died in the arms of his sergeant. He had been wounded several times. He'd been hit, I believe, in the leg and the groin and maybe a few other places. The last ball caught him in the roof of his mouth and was driven up through his head. He died in the arms of his sergeant, firing, if not his last round of canister, it was very nearly his last round of canister. His battery, under normal circumstances, should have been withdrawn from its position. He had several numbers that were exploded during the cannonade. He heroically held his ground, and he believes, or I believe he is due every honor that can be given to him. Does this answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I'd just like to take a minute, as having been superintendent of West Point is always known as an engineering school, but it was also an artillery school. And West Point at that time had the finest artillery school in the world. Union Confederate artillery were the best in the world at that time. No other country had better artillery than we did at that time.
Question? Yes, ma'am.
Do your uniforms
Yes, this is an original GAR medal. The coat I have on is actually a post-Civil War. It's an 1876 model. It's an Indian Wars uniform, but remember General Hartranft commanded the Pennsylvania National Guard from 1879 to 1889 when he died. The buttons on here are original Pennsylvania National Guard buttons from the 1870s. Anybody else? Okay, next question. Yes, back there.
This is for any of the generals. Did anybody serve with General David McGurry Gregg?
Anybody serve with General Gregg, who I believe is buried across the way here, is he not?
He's buried about 5 blocks from here.
And General Schimmelfennig, I understand, is also there.
And I noticed that were any of the generals at Gettysburg?
Yes, so General Hunt.
I'm sorry, your question, sir, you wanted to know who was at Gettysburg?
Any general was at Gettysburg. General Gregg served at Gettysburg, and historically, he was one of the heroes to turn the battle on the 3rd day. And I was wondering whether any of the Union generals present today had any chance of serving with him or alongside him or knew of General Gregg and his dedication to the Union against the Confederates, and whether anybody in this general group served at all or like before at Gettysburg.
Well, I was at Gettysburg. I was aware of General Gregg, but he's serving in the cavalry and I serving in the artillery. I'm sorry, we did not serve together. Yeah, General Gregg is a member of this organization. He's just not here today. I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
This is General Scott. General, what did you think of Robert E. Lee as a Army officer and as eventually an enemy commander?
Well, Colonel Lee, as you know, served with distinction under me in the war with Mexico. He showed me, indicated to me that at that time he was probably the best commander in the United States Army. As you know, and history tells, on the 17th of April, 2 days after the Sumter incident, my chief of staff at that time, Colonel Townsend, who isn't with us today, but Colonel Townsend summoned Colonel Lee to my offices at the War Department, and after consultation with President Lincoln, I had offered Colonel Lee the ability to lead the Union Army. You have to remember I was 75 years of age at the time. I was suffering from gout, from dropsy, from obesity. My days of active service, even though I was the longest serving general in American history, were coming to an end. General Lee, however, decided to turn on the oath that he made on the plane at West Point, would not answer directly any of my questions. Unfortunately, I became what I consider to be the second Benedict Arnold of the United States.
I probably spent more time with General Lee than anyone here. 1851, I was assigned to West Point as instructor of artillery and cavalry. Several months after arriving there, Colonel Lee, was appointed commandant of cadets. Probably one of the most gracious officers that I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. In fact, he and his wife had hosted a reception for my wife and I. I met my wife at West Point. We were married there while I was assigned there. I was subsequently sent out west, and in 1853 was reassigned as the junior major of the 2nd United States Cavalry. The commander of that was Albert Sidney Johnston, and second in command was Lieutenant Colonel Lee. Lieutenant Colonel Lee and I spent years together in Texas. A lot of that time was on court-martial duty, so it was just the two of us. Again, probably the finest officer I ever had an opportunity to serve under. It's just unfortunate he became a traitor to his country when it needed him most. There is no telling what the outcome of the Civil War may have been, or if it would have ever progressed very far had Lee accepted the offer of the President of the United States to command that army, but it's one of those things we'll never know. I never saw Colonel Lee again after that time. He was in Washington when I was still in Texas, and again, I never saw him again.
Next question. Yes, ma'am.
Probably Major General Thomas, either one has some cavalry background up there. I'll just tell you briefly, there was a presentation here about General Gregg, and the man who gave the presentation lived next door where Gregg had lived, and he received a book as a gift, which supposedly was a book that was used by General Gregg at West Point, and it was a book on astronomy. So my specific question is, did people who commanded cavalry have to have knowledge of astronomy to use when they were out moving from place to place in the war theater? And then the general question is, what specific courses did these people take at West Point when they were studying to become military commanders?
All cadets at West Point take the same curriculum. Curriculum is going to vary from year to year to year depending on who the commandant is, what they feel is important, what's not important. So the curriculum is continually changing. They would have had to have some knowledge of astronomy, typically around in a field, in the middle of God knows where. You need to be able to at least try to determine where you're at, or at least from going from point A to point B, which your direction of travel was, which is also many instances at night. So they would have had to. All of the courses, geometry, French was a big one, because most of the textbooks at that time on artillery, cavalry, etc. were written in French. Natural applied sciences, geology, mathematics. They would also take an artillery, cavalry, tactics, armament, ordnance, anything else you can think of. Again, the curriculum varied from year to year, so, but everyone took the same thing.
Next question. Yes, sir.
I presume that at least a few of you were men of strong Christian faith. Would any of you like to comment on how that faith inspired or comforted or figured in?
The question I believe us gentlemen here, I use that term loosely for some of us here, we're men of Christian faith, and how did that faith guide us during the war? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone?
I don't believe it. I was never one for one particular reason, one particular religious denomination or another one, although I tended to attend Episcopalian services. General Scott, you had more experience with that than me.
I had a very unique experience down in Mexico City. After taking Santa Ana and conquering Mexico and annexing the southwestern part of the United States, I became military governor of Mexico. As you know, the majority of the residents of Mexico were Roman Catholic. I decided, even though I was a devout Episcopalian, and I decided that it would be best, in the best interest of the government, to attend Catholic services in Mexico City, not only to show the people that I had respect for their beliefs and their ways, but also to gain the friendship of the ruling bishop of Mexico City, because I felt he could be a great help to me in the skirmishes that were taking place throughout the different sections of the city. I was scorned for my actions. As a matter of fact, I was a member of of the Masonic Lodge in Richmond, having been a native along with General Thomas of the Old Dominion. And for my actions in Mexico, at first they presented me with a presentation saber and then kicked me out of the bases for attending Catholic services. So in answer to your question, it did play a role in the Mexican War, and actually in the Civil War. You know, when I ran for president in 1852, I was the last presidential candidate in the Whig Party, and I was a staunch abolitionist. I believe many of my fellow officers had similar feelings about why we were fighting the war, and we felt that our cause was a just cause.
One further note on that. It was really the beginning of the chaplain service. So there were chaplains assigned to many of the regiments. Probably one of the most famous is Father Corby, who at the Battle of Gettysburg was the first to offer general absolution to the 69th, well, the Irish Brigade, which is 69th Pennsylvania, was one. 69th New York, I'm sorry, and a number of the other ones. He finally wrote a book on that later, only he was quoted at the time as saying that you would go directly to hell if you turned your back on the enemy. In his book, he left that part out because I think he kind of overstepped his bounds a little bit. But it was also a time of great religious revival during that period in our nation's history. Usually when you're facing death, all of a sudden you become a little more religious. So there were an awful lot of instances where there were revival meetings, camp meetings held regularly. Soldiers many times carried Bibles with them, either that they obtained along the way or were provided to them by the Christian Commission, the U.S. Sanitary Commission. When they went into battle, they typically discarded any decks of playing cards they had because they were considered evil, and if you went to heaven with a deck of playing cards, you weren't getting in. So religion at that point played a very big role in the lives of the individual soldiers. And if I just might regress for 1 second, when I said everyone in West Point took the same courses, you were assigned when you graduated based on your ranking academically and as part of discipline figured into your ranking, and you were assigned from there. So the top 2 or 3 would go into the engineer corps, and then the rest would be distributed between artillery, cavalry, and when you got kind of down near the bottom, they were infantry and rifles. So that's how you ended up being assigned. Now, whether General Gregg had been a lifelong cavalry officer, I don't know. I'm not sure. Something tends to make me think he was a dragoon, which would have meant he would have graduated before 1840 and been assigned to the dragoons, which were an earlier unit.
I was on the battlefield after the battles were over, and it's just hard to comprehend the degree of pain and suffering. You have to understand most of these were, very young men that were there and coming off the farm, never experiencing anything like this in their life before. They were dealing with hearing the screams of pain. They were dealing with seeing all their friends that were just dying or were dead that they were surrounded by. They were dealing with a large number of amputations and wondering whether they would ever get back home, would they ever be able to function again. And they really had never anything in their life to prepare them for dealing with this. One of the things that I did, and I know that other people who also do, were trying to support them, still having hope, supporting their courage to get through this. Youth of faith was one of the ways that we helped support, and in connection with family, reminding them of their family, having them write letters to their family to maintain a connection is a way to deal with some of the psychological trauma of all this.
To answer your question on a personal basis, when I would write home to my wife, oftentimes I would say that I would put my trust in him. And having escaped death on 4 different occasions by the end of the war, I had absolute trust in him that he had preserved me for some higher calling after the end of the war. Next question. Yes, sir, back there on the left.
This is for General Scott. When did he first notify or notice Chamberlain?
I'm sorry, what was that again?
When did you first realize that Chamberlain was in your service?
Joshua Chamberlain, are you talking about Joshua Chamberlain?
Yes.
Well, he was never in my service, sir. I retired in November the 1st of 1861.
Okay.
Unfortunately, General Chamberlain, we do have a General Chamberlain, but he could not be with us here today also. Yes, sir, back there again.
General Hunt, you had some differences with General Meade about artillery placement, battery assignment at Gettysburg, and probably before. What were the results in your favor or against? Did you want all the artillery under your command, or what exactly was that difference between you and General Meade?
If I understand your question correctly, sir, you're saying that I had differences with General Meade over artillery placement?
Not artillery placement, but artillery command situations, whether you were to get it or the corps commanders were to have jurisdiction over you, or what?
Sir, General Meade's orders to me on the morning of July 2nd, 1863 were to see to the placement of the guns. Those were his exact words to me. General Meade left tactical authority over placement of our artillery on the field. He left that entirely to me, sir. I had no major differences with General Meade. Now, perhaps you're talking about General Hooker at the Battle of Chancellorsville. During the Battle of Gettysburg, we had our artillery brigaded. Okay, six batteries formed an artillery brigade. Okay, now all of this was under my direct command. We also had a pool of approximately 100 guns in what we call the Artillery Reserve, which was under the command of Brigadier General Robert Tyler. Okay, an artillery brigade was attached to a Union corps. Okay, we had 7 corps in the Army of the Potomac. We had 7 artillery brigades. That's how the command structure is in the Army of the Potomac. Does this answer your question, sir?
All the way in the back, yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask the lady doctor. I believe you said you were captured and imprisoned.
Yes.
Were there any considerations given to your sex, or were you just thrown in there with all those men?
There was consideration in that I was given a single room, which was definitely a consideration. Everyone else they were crammed in like animals together, but they did give me a private room. I was given some consideration as well at times that I was allowed to go out of the prison more than other people, and I was able to roam the streets. But I think because I was a sensation as well, because how I was dressed, as you can see, I'm wearing pants with a short skirt, which was considered a very unacceptable way for women to dress. And so I got a lot of publicity from the newspapers that I was a very strange human being. They called me a hermaphrodite. They didn't really understand, and I think they wanted that negative publicity about me.
Were you able to help the other prisoners because of the conditions at some of those prisons were just so devastating, killing a lot of the prisoners because of poor sanitary conditions?
I really didn't. I volunteered to do it, and they would not allow me to do that. I wanted to provide medical care to the other prisoners. I believe that they didn't trust me in any way at all, so they kept me in isolation and would not want me to do that.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is for President Lincoln's secretary, Mr. Hay.
Nicolette.
I'm sorry.
Nicolette.
Nicolette, I'm sorry.
I am first personal secretary,
Yeah,
John Hay is
I was
secretary.
thinking of the other
Your
guy.
question,
Do you have any idea what happened to the mysterious lost copy of the Gettysburg Address?
There's around 8 copies of the Gettysburg Address.
Right.
They, one is named after me, one is named after John Hay. The one you're referring to was, should have been under the care of his son, Robert Todd Lincoln. It was lost for around 30 or 40 years. And then and there are various recollections about that my daughter recollected that it was returned to Robert Todd Lincoln. His daughter finally did find it. And the different copies they had, there was one even copied out in Lincoln's own hand and sent to a paper in New York City. It did not become important, the exact words, whether there was an and or the in different places, until in 1922 they decided to go and put those words in a granite wall in Washington when they finally built the Lincoln Memorial. So that's when you really see scholars trying to determine what were the exact words said, what should they be, and it's when they finally built the Lincoln Memorial in 1922 that it becomes more of an issue than at the time. At the time, we all thought it was a good speech. We didn't think it would have the lasting value that we all know now that it has.
Yes, ma'am.
Actually, this is Bruce Boyle. What were your thoughts on Mary Lincoln, and did she give you any special
Problems?
artifacts of the presidents after he was killed, or stayed in the family?
A lot of the artifacts did stay with the family, Robert Todd Lincoln possessing them.
But did she give you anything of the president?
It was more that I gave the things I had to Robert Todd Lincoln. And a lot of those were then given to the Library of Congress, historical societies. Those, that's really where most of those ended up. And we all know that there was problems with Robert Todd Lincoln not taking very good care of his mother. And as far as my relationship with her, yes, I was in charge of arranging state dinners, and she wanted to go and have her say in that, and there were arguments about that. I then went and gave that responsibility to my assistant, John Hay. He also had trouble with her. Her nickname was the Hellcat. And he then gave that responsibility to a third assistant, William Osai.
I believe there's a question on the balcony.
Yes, this is a great opportunity to ask the big loves down here something. I'm sure you're all aware how the common soldier just loves to inflict generals with nicknames. Some of them are endearing ones, such as Pat Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, nobly earned. Also some of slight derision, like Fuss and Feathers with General Scott. If there's one thing that's even worse, is the ones given to you by the enemy. And I was wondering if Commissary Banks or Spoons Butler could explain their nicknames, please.
Sometimes we spend our whole lives trying to live down nicknames. When I was 12, 13 years old, I set bobbins in a factory, and I received the nickname of Bobbin Boy. And other than that, I am not aware of any other nickname, as far as you know.
I endured considerable derision from the traitorous population. Most of my nicknames originated in in New Orleans during my tour of service there. As you'll recall, I had early as Farragut was taking command of the city, the flag was put up on the customs house, and William Mumford and a group of individuals took the flag down. It took us several months to find Mr. Mumford. We did. We tried him, and I hung him. I earned a death sentence from Jefferson Davis. I was to be, if captured by a Confederate Army, they were authorized to hang me on the spot. I didn't much care. It didn't bother me. I still walked through the streets of New Orleans. You'll also recall that during my time in New Orleans, I had a difficulty with some of the women in New Orleans. Their behavior didn't meet the social decorum appropriate for the time. I did issue an order to the women of New Orleans, saying that if any of them continued to treat the soldiers inappropriately, they would be arrested, held overnight, and treated as a woman plying her trade, and fined accordingly. The behavior did improve. I enjoyed another nickname called the Beast as a result of that particular nickname or adventure. But if you parse through my service in New Orleans, it was the only summer that the yellow fever did not hit the city because I cleaned the gutters. I got the animals and dead animals and all the other feces and everything else cleaned out the sewers and the water supply. I fed the population, much to the chagrin of the wealthy in New Orleans who were withholding money. So we took money from them and fed the poor while I was there. There was the story that my nickname Spoons, as I understand it. I'll tell you a story about that after the war, but there was always this issue about missing silverware and silver plate in New Orleans. I will tell you that none of that is true. All of it was receipted, every property was receipted properly. I was an attorney of significant success before and after the war. I frankly didn't need the money. So taking the silver really wasn't that important. And after the war, I bought a little boat at one yacht place. You might have heard of this race. My yacht's name is the America. And they've had cup races, I believe, ever since then. So I really didn't need the money. So that was clearly... But when I would run for office after the war, people would, my political opponents would hoist giant wooden spoons in the back of the things. And of course, I had to spar with them a little bit, and I would remind them that obviously there was one that got away. But I did endure some derision, and it's all part of doing the right thing.
Fuss and feathers was an endearing term. However, I was also known and greatly appreciative of the nickname Grand Old Man of the Army. Even though I had led militia in the Battle of Chippewa in 1814 in the Niagara Campaign, I felt the need even back then for a professionally trained, professionally organized armed force. And my entire life, especially with my assistance to the West Point situation, I did everything I could to modernize and to bring about a professional army. Somebody had asked me before, I thought they said England when they said Chamberlain. I had gotten to know Arthur Wellesley, who was the first Duke of Wellington. As you know, he defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. And when I was in England, I'd go to visit my wife, and she lived in Rome and in Paris. She liked the fashions there. But when I would go to visit her, I would stop in England and spend time at Apsley House, which was the Duke's London home behind Buckingham Palace. And after the war with Mexico, probably the most endearing term to be given to me was from Arthur Wellesley when he termed me the greatest general of the 19th century.
And well, you are, sir. I probably had more sobriquets than any officer in the Army. The two you mentioned, the Rock of Chickamauga, Pap Thomas, Old Tom, George Washington, the Sledge in Nashville, and as Lincoln referred to me, the Virginian. One that was probably the most difficult was Old Slow Trot, and probably the most misunderstood. It was used by my detractors to indicate that I was slow and plodding, when actually it was more deliberate and studied than the former. But it came about as a result of being responsible for cavalry training at West Point. The mounts at West Point were in horrible shape. They were blind, they were deaf, they were lame, they were swayback. They were the worst animals that were possible. And typically the command would have been slow, and then the next command in line would be trot. Those horses couldn't trot. And the cadets were always fighting or chomping at the bit to get them to move, so typically the command was slow, and then slow trot. And then that just stuck with me from that point on. Anyone else?
Neglected one additional name that was given to me. The press would always refer to me as a pirate and a pillager as such. And I think that had to do with my father, who I never met, but who was a licensed privateer by the U.S. government. He died in the islands from of yellow fever. So I had that lineage as well. It was firstly also a question whether I was half black or mulatto and all the other things as a result of my father's service in the islands as a licensed pirate or a privateer, as you would know it.
My men affectionately called me Black John. You remember this was many, many years ago, and the reason they called me Black John is because I had black hair and a black mustache. That was obviously many, many years ago. Yes, sir, up there in the balcony.
Captain Upton. Yes. Two-part question for you, if you would. One in character and one out of Christmas. First of all, what did you do to mule shoes that was so extraordinary? Would you please explain that for people? And the second question is, you have to step out of character, but would you explain your unfortunate demise at the late in life?
The tactic that I used at the mule shoe is everything prior to that, everybody would line up in a straight row and attack a point. My idea was you take 2 men at a time and do like a football play. And it was harder to train all the guns at a single point than it was at a broad point. And it was harder for them to get it. It actually worked. And if I'd have been supported, it would have taken the day. At the end of my career, I was suffering from my wife had died. I missed her deeply, and today they would call it post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I opted out. Thank you.
Would it be out of order at this point to ask you about your organization, how you all got interested in this, how long it's been? You're also articulate and you're also in character. How long did this take?
I'm going to let that up to some. I've only been in this 2 years now, and it's, I was just saying from a personal standpoint, it is a continuous, non-stop study of not only of the person's activities, but also his character and his personality. And that is so very, very hard to find, but yet we continue to do it.
I think that's some of the little levity. I had taken on the persona of General Scott roughly about 4 years ago. Prior to that, I was a captain of the Sons of Veterans Reserve, which is the military arm of a regular organization known as the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. Having been given that by my great-great-grandfather who served in the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry at Gettysburg. We were in the library at home and we were reading the memoirs of Winfield Scott that he wrote in 1862. I'm lucky enough to have a first edition of them. Sometimes my eyesight isn't what it used to be, and my wife is an avid reader. So she was reading different passages to me, as I was studying, and all of a sudden she stopped. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "My God, you didn't pick Winfield Scott, he picked you." And I think that was right after it came out that he was arrogant, self-centered, egotistical.
I think I'm the oldest, or longest. I think I've been doing this 6 or 7 or 8 years, I forget what. Typically, we'll start out and it just looks like fun. And you get to dress up and walk around. And then you start to get serious about it. And we go around and everybody, it almost develops a connection somehow. For me, it was obviously the movie Gettysburg. As many of you saw Gettysburg, and I was like, wow. And so we go out to Gettysburg and take the kids around, and I go up on a little round top, and there's the 20th Maine. And then I go over on Big Round Top, and there's the 20th Maine Monument. July 3rd, they weren't here. They were smack in the middle of the battlefield, the safest place they could be. The National Park Service got it wrong. Duh. Okay, so now I don't know anything about the Civil War. So I start to study and start to learn about it, and I'm intrigued by George Thomas, because as it turns out, George Thomas is winning these battles and all these things, and there's not a whole lot written about him. So I started studying him, and that's why I decided to do him. Only to find out some years later, George Thomas in 1861 was first assigned to command the army, his own army, actually, the first army that first army he commanded, but that he built from scratch, which was in Kentucky. And that became the first Brigade, 1st Division, 14th Corps. I was a rifleman in Vietnam, and one day I'm looking at the unit crest, and in the corner of the unit crest is a little red acorn. And that little red acorn is 1st Brigade, 1st Division, 14th Corps. So in effect, I served in the same unit that George Henry Thomas formed in 1861, and I'm there in 1967. So that just turned out to be the connection, and ever since then, it's just been a study. John?
I was bitten by the Civil War bug, if you will, when I was about 11 or 12 years old on my first trip to Gettysburg with my father. Whenever he laughs at me, particularly in the summertime, for dressing up in wool in 90 plus degrees heat, I said, "Well, Dad, it's your fault. You got me interested in this." I decided I wanted to become a living historian. Actually, when I saw this fine group of gentlemen in action at Gettysburg, my wife and I had just come out of a store in Gettysburg, and we saw a posted ad that a bunch of generals were going to be giving a talk at a local farm, and we thought it would be interesting to go out and see it. And from that very first time that I saw this group of gentlemen in action, I knew that this is what I wanted to do. As far as the persona that I've chosen, Henry Jackson Hunt, he's not one of the better known generals of the war. He's sort of he's sort of a I don't want to say that he's a lesser figure, but he doesn't have the notoriety of many of the others. But yet he contributed greatly to bringing about reforms in the artillery. And using practices and tactics that are still in use in modern warfare. I just knew that this is what I wanted to do when I saw these men in action.
I'll just quickly add that I didn't serve in the military, but I studied Civil War history and politics, and that was kind of an area that I've lectured on and studied at great length. I kind of became enamored with the character of Butler because he was a politician, no formal military training, everything he learned in the militia. And some would argue it's easy for me to adopt his kind of ornery personality because it sort of fits me at times. And you kind of find a person you just kind of embrace because you find there's more to the story than maybe calling him Beast Butler or Spoons and other things. And you realize that the guy was really quite ahead of his time and a forward thinker. A good example would be that he favored the Gatling gun and actually bought them out of his own pocket for his troops because he thought a rapid fire piece of weapon would be more effective than a single shot cannon. The West Pointers never really bought into that during the war. So my Civil War stuff started in, I think, a family vacation I planned in 1971 to Gettysburg. And so it's sort of been one of those journeys for me. And I really enjoy it. I enjoy, speaking with the kids and these kinds of settings. It's a lot of fun to kind of relay the history.
Well, I've been doing this for about 15 years. I did serve in the United States Army, but for the main reason I do this is to honor my ancestors. I have 8 ancestors that served in the Civil War, and one died at Andersonville Prison.
I'm the newest member of COOG. I've been a member for less than a month. This is my first event. But to answer your question, I was introduced to COOG by Miss Lilly, who I've known for most of her life, and she introduced me to General Scott. I retired a year ago as a lieutenant colonel from the Air Force after 32 years, enlisted an officer. So the appeal of wearing a uniform again, of a much higher rank, and I've always been enthusiastic about history, so that's how I became part of the group.
Let me say we continue to recruit. Typically someone will come in as a generic officer, staff officer, a captain, lieutenant, colonel, and then try to see where they fit. It's not an inexpensive hobby. Uniforms are expensive, but ball gowns will kill you.
Well, my story is a little bit different. When my husband joined about 4 years ago, this was an all-male organization. Women were supportive of their husbands, and like the other women, I got involved in learning how women dressed during that period of time and what women's role was during that period of time. Someone gave me a book of Dr. Mary Walker, and I immediately identified with her and her struggles. I am a doctor myself. When I went to medical school, I had a lot of the same struggles being accepted by a woman way back then. And then I decided that I would take her on as a persona. I felt very much like her, and then began my struggles as this organization had no women as members of this organization. And so I felt that 150 years after Mary Walker was struggling to try to get a commission in the Army, I was struggling with this group to be able to sit here with all these men and be able to tell her story, which I obviously succeeded in being able to do thanks to them.
Well, I was born here on the East Coast of Virginia. Dad was in the Navy, so by the time I was 8 years old, we lived in 6 different states and 1 foreign country. So every time I changed schools, the kids would say, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from Virginia." And they go, "Oh, you're a rebel." What the heck is this rebel thing? So I learned early on about the American Civil War and had been involved with it for quite some time. I worked for 40 years at the county in California and retired and thought, now's my chance because I'm not teaching at night, I'm not working all day, at weekends, etc. And I went and got myself a uniform as a first sergeant in artillery. Since when I was in Vietnam, I was in artillery. And came here to Gettysburg one summer and ran into General Grant. And just to get talking with him a little bit, and gentleman portraying General Grant says, "Well, what brings you to Gettysburg?" I said, "Well, my wife and I are thinking about moving here." He goes, "Oh, really? I moved here about 5 years ago." He says, "Where are you moving from?" I said, "Anaheim, California." He says, "What intersection?" And I told him, he says, "We live less than a mile apart." So he says, "How'd you like to be on my staff?" I said, "Oh, I'd love it." He says, "It's got to be at least a colonel." "Who do you want to be?" I said, I don't know, who do you got? He said, "Well, I need, I don't know, who am I? Need the porter." I said, "Okay, I'll be porter." I just happened to have his book. And got with that and kept up with it. Now my wife said, "Don't ever ask me to be involved. I don't want to be involved with that. You do your thing." I said, "Okay." So we moved to Gettysburg here about 3.5 years ago. One of the neighbors took her out and, I don't know, got her to try on a corset, dress. She now has 7 dresses, 2 ball gowns, and just in this last 3 weeks has bought 3 more dresses. So I'm glad I didn't ask her to get involved earlier.
Thank you. I'm a physician, but I've always had a deep interest in history, and particularly Civil War history. In fact, I might say that if I ever get another life, I'd like to be a historian, maybe. And I think the American history in general, and Civil War history in particular, is underappreciated. Particularly that this is largely what is responsible for Republican government becoming the standard for the world. Prior to the American Civil War, the American experiment, as it was called, was expected to fail. As a matter of fact, Russell, in the Times of London, wrote that there are people who are alive today who saw the birth of the American experiment who are going to live to see it fail. Within a generation or 2 after the Civil War, Republican government became the standard for the whole world. That's because of us. Even North Korea claims to be a republic. That is the world standard now. We're the reason for it. I chose my character, Jonathan Letterman, because he is a physician and because he made a truly lasting contribution. And that is what he did in the mid-19th century is still valid today. The organization that he put together, the lives he saved, and he's still saving lives today. The chief of operations, of medical operations of the Allied Expeditionary Force in World War II, credited him with the organization that saved American lives during World War II. This is a physician with some management skills, someone I could admire, someone I immediately bonded with. So it is really my personal pleasure to be Dr. Jonathan Letterman.
Very quickly, I came to Civil War history interest very late in life. Not very late. That was age 32. I was not 11 like some folks. I was serving as the executive officer of a training battalion at Fort Dix, New Jersey. I have about 14 years of service in the U.S. Army. Back then, my battalion commander said, "Hey, Frank, go take the officers and NCOs out to Gettysburg for an officer professional involvement class." We call it a staff ride at Gettysburg. Didn't really know much about Civil War history beyond what we all get in school, so the first thing I grabbed was a work called The Killer Angels by Michael Schrock. And then I teamed up with a historian, late J. Lubas from the Army War College back then, and he served as our guide. Went out and actually walked the ground for all 3 days of the battle. So I developed an interest back then, but really in terms of this particular group, I was kind of a little hesitant. I'm very closely allied with General Thomas over there, and he was saying, "Hey, why don't you join? Why don't you join?" And I said, "Well, I don't really see myself as a general. I was a major of artillery when I was in the service, so I have an interest there. Do I fit?" General Thomas actually did a little research, very quick, found some major who was a noted artilleryman in the West. I said, "Well, how about this guy?" I started looking into it. I became very, very interested in John Mendenhall. It's an opportunity to do some net new research on the officer, and as it turns out, he didn't even know it. I was very, very close, and his assistant adjutant general, Army of the Cumberland, next to General Thomas day in, day out during 1864. He didn't realize it. So I feel fortunate to be able to portray John Mendenhall and also to try to do as much research as I can to further his story. And just as a side note, back when Alaska was a very, very, remote kind of territory for the United States, I was actually commander of the Army unit and actually the senior ranking U.S. official in Alaska. So I'm still counted today as an early governor of Alaska.
I am from Berks County. I grew up in Holy. There is a round table here, the first offenders here in Berks County. My cousin is also a member of that. Robert Grimm is an attorney in Kutztown. It was through our family tree that I found out that I had a great uncle who served in the Civil War. So naturally I said, well, I have to find out more about this individual. His name is Andrew Jackson Grimm. His father was George Washington Grimm. And I came to discover that he served in Company C of the 51st Pennsylvania. If you take a look at the Battle of Burnside's Bridge in September of 1862, you will see it was Company C that led that charge across Burnside's Bridge. So I'm naturally familiar. I said, well, this is very, very interesting. Let me do some more research with regards to the commanding officer, who was John Hartranft. The more I read about Hartranft, the more I became enamored with the individual. And I said, I can relate to him because he is German by background. I am, obviously, my last name is Grimm. So I am German by background. I now have, my mentor is the great-granddaughter of General Hartranft. So I get an opportunity to read his personal letters, his correspondence, see all of those neat things that nobody ever sees, like his uniforms, his swords, and 4 pieces of rope that were taken down on July 7th, 1865, that were used to hang the 4 conspirators. And you will never see those. So this is just absolutely awe-inspiring for me to do this. So one thing led to the other and to the other, and now you know the rest of the story. In essence, why all of us are here doing this, because some of us really do have connections with family during the Civil War, depending upon, I guess it made difference which side it was. Okay, next question here. Don't be bashful. Yes, sir, there in the back.
With everybody in the war, especially the officers and higher ups, went to West Point. Can you shed some light on the reason why these folks, you guys alumni, were chosen or put in those positions from West Point?
At the time I was just in Newsom Depot, Virginia, my uncle, who I was clerking for at the time, the local congressman came through, mentioned to my uncle that he had a position available at West Point, and my uncle thought that I would be suitable for it. So the congressman by the name of James Mason recommended me. This was in 1839 on the way to West Point. I stopped by his office in Washington, introduced myself, and he said to me, son, I've never appointed anyone who graduated. If you fail to graduate, I never want to see your face again. Unfortunately for him, by the time Virginia seceded, he would have already passed. Or I think he would have also had a problem seeing my face again. West Point.
My father, Lieutenant Thomas Hunt, served in the Army. He was fairly well connected politically. It was through our local congressman that I received my appointment to the point.
Well, as you know, I made several trips to West Point while I was General-in-Chief. As I mentioned to you earlier, I had a keen interest in having a professional Army under me. A lot of the information that I picked up both in France in 1832, a visit to France in 32, and subsequent visits to England with the Duke, gave me a plethora of information, one of which being the Guide to War that was written by Bonaparte. Being fluent in French, I was able to adapt that and rewrite it into English, and mandated that as the official Army guide for the United States Army in 1839. I would say that West Point, by that point, as you know, there was Sandhurst over in England, but West Point really stood out, I thought, as producing the best of the best of a professional military army. They were doing what had to be done, especially in the fields of engineering, because you really can't run an army without engineering, proper engineering. Excuse me. I decided to retire to the point. I think, yeah, stepping out of character, a minute, a general who would come long after I did, and like me, lead troops in 3 major engagements of the United States. A fellow by the name, I'm told, of MacArthur said it best when he said, "My last conscious thoughts will be of the Corps, and the Corps."
General Scott is still at West Point today.
Even though Father was governor of Pennsylvania, it did not get me in on my first attempt. So I had to go to Harvard for a year. And I went on my own to my representative, my congressman, who also told me, "I'm sick and tired of sending you people to the academies and failing. I don't want to do it anymore." And I assured him that I will not fail. And again, I graduated 3rd in my class. I think the part of the question is why were we moved up? Again, looking at West Point as being one of the best engineering schools in the nation at the time, and still is, we had the ability and the background to do the maneuvers, move the men, the equipment, and everything. And so we moved over from the regular army into the volunteer armies and rapidly moved up. And of course, a lot of time when the war was over, we moved back to the regular army, we were reduced. I'm sure you realize that with General Custer. He was a lieutenant colonel at Little Bighorn. So that's the main reason I think that the West Point men did all the advancements, is they had the background.
I'd like to point out also that you have to remember that almost every major command during the Civil War, whether it be Confederate or Union, was commanded by a West Point graduate. West Point was founded in 1802, largely through the efforts of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson.
All right, I believe we have time for one more question. I want to give you some time to talk to us individually here before we move to our mess deck. Those of us who are in the Marines, I guess I'm the only Marine here. We'll move to our mess deck at 1500 this afternoon. One more question. Yes, sir.
Can you explain brevet conditioning and were those positions lost after the war or after that?
Brevet. By the end of the war, I was a brevet major general. I was a brevet major general of volunteers. My permanent rank was brigadier general of volunteers, and General Grant personally breveted me to major general. That means it's a temporary grade. In a few months after the war ended, on behalf of General Meade, sent a letter up the chain of command to have me permanently promoted to major general. It didn't get very far. I decided that I wasn't going to stay in because my family had asked me to come home, so I never had the permanent rank of major general. I did have the temporary rank of major general by the end of the war. However, I did become a major general as the first commanding general of the Pennsylvania National Guard. So it was a temporary rank, and it depended upon the circumstance.
Brevets were usually offered as a result of some kind of an action. They didn't have medals. You weren't paid for it. When you were off duty, you could wear the uniform of the brevet rank that you had. I was promoted to brevet first lieutenant. I was promoted to brevet captain and brevet major for the Seminole Wars up through the Union Wars. At the beginning of the war, you had a regular army, a standing army. Government hates standing armies, always has, always will. That's an annual appropriation through Congress, and there are a certain number of officers, number of enlisted, number of branches on it. It's annual appropriation. When the war broke out, they had to raise an army in a hurry. That became a different appropriation. So all of those who became officers under that were assigned as volunteers. So in effect, you could have one rank in a regular army, which may be captain. You can hold a brevet as a colonel. You can have a volunteer rank as a colonel. You can hold a brevet in a volunteer army as a major general.
So it became very convoluted as to who was in charge and who wasn't. But brevets were typically for some kind of an action that you were rewarded. That's the situation here. Gee, George Custer was a general. Well, how come at the Little Bighorn he was a colonel? He was a lieutenant colonel, because that was his rank in the regular army. As individuals were killed or individuals retired, in the regular army, if you were a regular army officer, you could be promoted to those positions. So you could have one rank in the regular army, one rank afterwards. The only ranks that were guaranteed at the end of the war were brigadier general and up. So if you got to the rank of brigadier general, you were guaranteed a job in the regular army after the war. But again, as myself, there were only 5 major generals authorized in the regular army. But there were hundreds of brigadiers or major generals, in the volunteer army. So all these gentlemen you see behind you that are holding commissions, they're all holding commissions except for General Scott in the volunteer army. Once the war is over, they're either gone or they're going to accept a lower position. And by then, brevets are done away with.
I received my brevet rank of Brigadier General, but by the end of the war I got a second star as a Major General brevet rank. My duties and responsibilities as Chief of Artillery demanded that I be given this rank. I was assuming tactical authority of all the guns, all the artillery pieces of the Army of the Potomac. This itself was a change from the previous Chief of Artillery. A friend of mine, Bill Barry, General William Barry, commanded, or he was Chief of Artillery, but his position in the Army was merely that of an advisor. Okay, the commanding general would dictate where artillery was to be placed. He would consult his Chief of Artillery to see whether he agreed with that or not. I was not satisfied with being merely an advisor. When General Barry moved to a job at the War Department, I was called into a meeting with General McClellan just days before the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. He said, Henry, I need a new artillery chief. Bill Barry's going to the War Department. Are you interested in the job? I was a colonel of artillery at the time. I said, General McClellan, I will accept the position only on the condition that I be given tactical authority over the guns. I want command. And much to my surprise, General McClellan said yes. And he was responsible for seeing that I attained the rank befitting my duties and responsibilities.
Very quickly, I was never breveted to command. I entered the war as a brigadier general, but commanding the militia. But my rise to that rank wasn't necessarily for bravery or anything like that. I was called to Boston to meet with Governor Andrews as the militia units were being deployed, and the legislature in Massachusetts was not in session. I happened to have a friend in the local bank who was willing to fund the militia, so I brought a check and my services to Governor Andrew, and I was given the rank over the more senior officer. So that's kind of launched my career. So I guess it wasn't a brevet, but money that was needed at the moment to fund the Army, and I was able to provide it.
When I was put on General Grant's staff, I was a captain, and he promoted me to lieutenant colonel at $261 a month. Not bad. After Appomattox, Congress gave every officer, just about every officer, 1 or 2 brevet ranks as just, congratulations, the war is over, basically. That took effect, that was backdated to the 13th of March, 1865. I got 2 brevet promotions, colonel and brigadier general. When we went back to Washington at $261 a month with families living in Washington City, you can't do that. So General Babcock and myself shared a house with our families so that we could share our food and the accommodations. And at the end of President Grant's first term, I was very lucky to get the job of the Vice President of the Pullman Palace Car Company at $10,000 a year contract. That was a nice upgrade.
Officers were paid the same amount no matter whether they were volunteer or regular army. They all received. They weren't paid at the president, but at the rank of their gentleman.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you on behalf of the Confederation. We're going to hang around for about 15 minutes or so. We do have a dining reservations locally at 3 o'clock, so if you want to ask some personal questions of these individuals that you were not necessarily want to ask in public here about our private lives before and after the war, you may certainly do.